All right, good morning, good afternoon. Well, I guess I know what time it is. Y'all are in the morning time watching this. I want to do two things. I want to check our exercise 19, which followed lesson 20 on the syllogism. So a syllogism, you will recall, is a special kind of argument. And we don't mean argument in the sense that Mom and Dad aren't letting me play with the Nintendo Switch today, and so I'm mad at them, or brother stepped on my Lego set, and so I'm mad at him. We mean argument in the sense of a series of statements, one of which is supported or implied by the others. Most of the time we're looking at three statements. The supported statement, the one that is being supported by the others, we call the conclusion. And the statements that are doing the supporting, we call our premises. They're going to be some kind of evidence or reasoning for why we believe whatever we believe, or why we're trying to prove whatever we're trying to prove in the conclusion. A syllogism is a formal argument, and then specifically a categorical syllogism is an even more formal argument in which we have two premises followed by the conclusion. We give those premises names based on the terms that they contain. The premise that contains the major term we call the major premise. The premise that contains the minor term we call the minor premise. And then finally, of course, you have your conclusion. Now you should be wondering, well, wait, how did we know again which one was the major premise, which one was the minor premise, and wasn't there another premise, a middle premise? Is there a middle? I'm sorry. Oh, I just messed that up. I don't think I'm going to edit anything in this video, though, so just running it back. You should be wondering, well, wait, how did we know what the major term was in the first place to find the minor premise? Major premise, minor premise. This is a confusing topic, no doubt. How did we know what the major term was so that we could find the major premise in the first place? How did we know what the minor term was so that we could find the minor premise in the first place? And wasn't there another thing called the middle term? Is there a middle premise that's contained in? How do we find the middle term? So we're going to review precisely that as we look at the homework for exercise 19. I've got number 1 already done here. This came from an argument that you may recall from exercise 18. And we should have underlined that conclusion. All calculus problems are theology. You can see I've got that underlined right here. All calculus problems are theology. We always want to begin with the conclusion because you will hopefully recall it's the conclusion that tells us what is the major term and what is the minor term. What we said last week is that the subject of the conclusion is always the minor term. In fact, you probably remember I made you repeat that like 1 billion times. The subject of the conclusion, by definition, is the minor term. The subject of the conclusion is the minor term. The predicate of the conclusion, whatever comes last in the conclusion, is your major term. Again, by definition, we don't need to see the major term anywhere else. It doesn't need to satisfy any particular characteristics. If it's the predicate of the conclusion, it is the major term. Finally, whatever term appears in both of the premises but not the conclusion, that's what we called our middle term. It is the middle term in the sense that it is between the major and minor term. It's going to be what connects the major and minor term. So in this particular argument, the term that did not appear in the conclusion but did appear in both premises is a study in infinity. And so that was number 1. Major term theology, minor term calculus problems, middle term study in infinity. I'm going to go through the rest of these rather more quickly. Number 2, all space stations are important technology, but some space stations are not a product of American ingenuity. Therefore, so that's our clue, that's our conclusion indicator word, right? Therefore, some important technology is not a product of American ingenuity. And as soon as I have my conclusion, I have my major and minor terms. The major term, again, is the predicate of the conclusion. So a product of American ingenuity is our major term. So let's write that down. A product of American ingenuity is the major term. The subject of that conclusion, important technology, is going to be our minor term. So let's write that down. Important technology. And now there should be a term that did not appear in the conclusion, but does appear in both of the premises. So as you look through the rest of the argument, what else did appear in the argument but did not come up in the conclusion? And hopefully you can tell, oh, it was space stations, right? That's not a moon, that's a space station. It was space stations. So our middle term must be space stations. So there's number 2. Mark each of these blanks separately. They're going to be minus 2 points for each one that you get wrong. Let's go on to number 3. You can see I've already underlined the conclusion there. Some pagans are idolaters. We get a premise indicator word following it, because, and so that's what tells us the rest of that sentence is premises. Idolaters is the predicate there, so idolaters will be the major term. Pagans is the subject of that conclusion, so that's what tells us that pagans will be the minor term. And finally, what term appeared elsewhere in the argument but not in the conclusion? Christians, right? I can see Christians in both of these premises, but they were not in the conclusion, and so that must be the middle term, Christians. So there's number 3. Number 4, all objects in free fall are weightless, and all meteoroids are objects in free fall. Therefore, another conclusion indicator, all meteoroids are weightless. Predicate must be the major term. So weightless or weightless objects would be the major term. The subject of that conclusion, meteoroids, must be our minor term, meteoroids. And again, I'm not figuring that out based on some property of meteoroids or where meteoroids happens to appear elsewhere in the argument. I'm simply looking at my conclusion, identifying the subject. The subject is the minor term. Identifying the predicate. The predicate is the major term. Predicate of the conclusion is the major term. Subject of the conclusion is the minor term. Every time, no matter what. Middle term, of course, appears elsewhere in the argument but not in the conclusion. So what else here appears in the argument but did not appear in the conclusion? Objects in free fall. So objects in free fall must be our middle term. Finally, number 5, all marsupials are pouched animals, and some marsupials are not Australian mammals. Consequently, conclusion indicator, some Australian mammals are not pouched animals. Well, what is, oh gosh, I keep doing that. What is our predicate? Pouched animals. So that is the major term, pouched animals. What is the subject of that conclusion? Australian mammals. So Australian mammals is our minor term. And finally, what other term appeared in the argument but did not appear in those premises? Marsupials, right? So marsupials must be our middle term. So there's the first 5 problems for exercise 19. We identify our major term, our middle term, and our minor term by looking for the conclusion. Subject of the conclusion is always the minor term. Predicate of the conclusion is always the major term. Middle term does not appear in the conclusion, but appears elsewhere. Turn the page. 6 through 10, we were supposed to identify not just what major term, middle term, and minor term were. In fact, you can see there's nowhere we were specifically supposed to write that down, but instead we're supposed to use the major term, minor term, and middle term to properly organize the argument. So these are not in standard order already. We want to go major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Again, though, we actually have to start with the conclusion, so that's what I'm going to do. Some Socratic sages are not perspicacious people since, so there's our premise indicator, but remember, whatever follows a premise indicator is a premise. whatever precedes a premise indicator is usually a conclusion. So I think the conclusion here is going to be some Socratic sages are not perspicacious people. I may need to abbreviate some of the rest of these so that you're not just kind of sitting here staring at me write stuff. Then, just like before, once we have our conclusion, what do we know? The major term must be perspicacious people. The minor term must be Socratic sages. But furthermore, we can now use these terms to help us organize the argument. Wherever else perspicacious people comes up, that must be the major premise. Wherever else Socratic sages comes up, that must be the minor premise. And again, we always want to go in that order: major premise, minor premise, conclusion. So, where else do perspicacious people come up? It is down here in that final clause. So let's rewrite that. Some perspicacious people are also metaphorical masters. And then, of course, whatever else is there must be the minor premise. But we can see Socratic sages comes up in that other clause. Some Socratic sages are metaphorical masters. We didn't need this next part, but just so you can see, we've got our minor term appearing twice, our major term appearing twice, and of course it must be what was not in the conclusion, but was in both of the premises, metaphorical masters, that is the middle term of that argument. So that's number 6. Number 7, again, I would begin with the conclusion. Some criminals are heroes of the faith. I'm going to abbreviate here. Heroes of the faith must be my major term, as it is the predicate of that conclusion. So wherever else that pops up must be the major premise. So some heroes of the faith were murderers. And then, of course, whatever is the other premise must be our minor premise. All murderers are criminals. And I can see subject of the conclusion, the minor term, appears twice. The predicate of the conclusion, the major term, appears twice. And, of course, the middle term also appears twice in each premise, but not in the conclusion. Number 8, I already have done there. The conclusion was no racing car is street legal. So from that, we can figure out that it should have gone in the order: no street legal vehicles are stock cars, all stock cars are racing cars, no racing car is street legal. So that's number 8. Number 9 should go in this order. I'm just going to give you the answer now. All easily located statements are sentences at the end of an argument. Some sentences at the end of an argument are not conclusions. Therefore, 3 dots, some conclusions are not easily located statements. And again, you might abbreviate to make that a little bit easier, but that is the order that number 9 should go in. Last one, number 10, we should begin with no great writing is worthless instructional material. Some pagan literature is great writing. Therefore, 3 dots, some pagan literature is not worthless instructional material. And again, if you're having trouble seeing, great writing was the middle term there. It appears in both premises, but not the conclusion. Pagan literature is your middle term. So of course, your minor term. So of course it appears in the minor premise. And then worthless instructional material was the major term. So that's how I knew what the major premise was. Okay, so that's your homework. That's your exercise 19. The actual lesson for today is on what we call the form of a syllogism, mood and figure. So we're going to figure out what our mood and figure of a syllogism. You can just flip over to the next page. Again, you can grade this later. It's -2 for each blank and -6 if you got the whole thing wrong. If you missed all 10, that would be a 40. But let's go ahead and look at lesson 21 now, the mood of syllogisms. So what we will soon discover is that the actual terms in an argument don't matter very much at all. They do affect whether the argument has true statements or false statements. But we're not going to worry about that just yet. What we're interested in is what do the arguments look like? What's the form of the argument? And form of an argument, form of a syllogism, is simply the mood plus the figure. So these two lessons we're going to look at today, 21 and 22, cover mood and figure. Mood, you can see here, lesson 21. Figure is going to be lesson 22. Is there a woodpecker? What's going on? What is that sound? Oh well. It's an intense sound. All right. Because the syllogism is composed of categorical statements, the syllogism can be abbreviated following the same rules concerning the substitution of letters for terms. In this book, we will have a standard substitution, so let's make sure we're familiar with this. S in general will represent the minor term. P in general will represent the major term. And M will represent the middle term. So we want to make sure we're familiar with that, because what we're going to do is use S, P, and M to build something called a schema. This is basically the skeleton for the syllogism. Let's take a look at a particular syllogism to figure out what's going on here. So this is already in standard order. Some black cars are fast cars. All Model T cars are black cars. Therefore, some Model T cars are fast cars. And if you wanted to confirm that it was in standard order, major premise, minor premise, conclusion, of course we've got the indicator therefore that's telling us that's a conclusion. The subject of that conclusion, Model T cars, must be the minor term, so you can see it appearing again in the minor premise, that second statement. The predicate, fast cars, must be the major term, so that's why it appeared in the first premise. We call that the major premise. And then, of course, the term that appears twice, but not in the conclusion, is our middle term. So in this case, that's black cars. Now, again, without thinking about whether this argument is true or false, whether the logic is good or bad, we're not worried about any of that right now. We want to create a skeleton, a schema of this argument. So we're going to break this down without the actual terms. We need to know where they go. We need to know where the major term is, minor term is, etc. But we don't actually care about Model T cars and black cars and fast cars. That is essentially a distraction when we're looking at the form of a syllogism. So notice what we've done here. Because we don't actually care about the terms, we're going to take the major term, fast cars, and we're just going to replace it with an abbreviation, P. And then we're going to do the same thing for the minor term. Model T cars, you can hopefully tell the positions between these two arguments are the same. Model T cars, we're going to replace with S. And then finally, black cars, which was the middle term, we're going to replace with M. And so when we arrange a syllogism in standard order with these abbreviations, that's what we mean when we talk about a schema. So schemas should always look like this. They will have one of our categorical statements. You might notice we've got some MRP. Now think back to your square of opposition. Where on the square did some MRP go? Was it an A statement, E statement, O statement, or, oh wait, some MRP? That was what we called an I statement, right? And then we had another categorical statement. All SRM is what we call an A statement. And finally, we finished up with our conclusion, which was another I statement, right? Some SRP is another I statement. And so this is an IAI syllogism. And that is precisely what we mean when we talk about the mood of a syllogism. The mood of a syllogism is simply the various possible combinations of our categorical statements, A, E, I, and O. And so anytime we are looking at a schema, we can tell what the mood is simply by identifying the kinds of statements that we're using. I apologize for the audio. I don't know if y'all are getting distracted. I am super distracted. But what are you going to do? This is when I have time to record the video. So that's what we mean by mood. We simply list out the kinds of statements that we use for the major premise, then minor premise, then conclusion. If we went back to, say, this last homework example from exercise 19, what would the mood of that syllogism be? Take a second, look at it, think about your square of opposition, and you should have a 3-letter mood that you can give me in. Okay, what do you think? No great writing is worthless. That was an E statement, right? Some pagan literature is great writing. That was an I statement. Some pagan literature is not worthless. That was an O statement. And so the mood of this syllogism is E, I, O. And that's all we mean when we talk about the mood of a syllogism. What we want to be able to do is categorize all of a certain kind of syllogism together. Again, what the terms are, whether I'm talking about great writing, worthless instructional material, pagan literature, Model T cars, fast cars, black cars, dogs, cats, mammals, I don't care. I want to be able to analyze all of a given syllogism together regardless of what the terms are. So part of that is mood, identifying what kinds of statements make up your major premise, minor premise, then conclusion. But then the other part of that, because that's not everything, the other part of that is what we call figure. So here's why we need figure. Let's consider something like, do they have an example here? Well, you might see them say, I'm looking now at page 154, EIO1. Ignore the 1 for a second because we don't know what that is yet. But let's say we knew some syllogism we want to build is an EIO syllogism. We want to write a schema right now. We want to build out the skeleton of an argument that satisfies EIO. So the major premise needs to be an E statement. Well, hold on. What was an E statement? No blank are blank, right? And then an I statement should be our minor premise. What was an I statement? Some blank are blank. And then finally, our conclusion looks like it's supposed to be an O statement. We put our 3 dots, and then an O statement on the square was some blank are not blank. And that's our O statement. At this point, we can even fill in some of the letters. Remember, the minor term is always the subject of the conclusion, and we want to symbolize it with S. So we already know where that minor term goes. The major term is always the predicate of the conclusion. And we always want to symbolize that with P, so that has to go there. In fact, we even kind of know a little bit more. We know that P is going to appear somewhere in that major premise, but the problem is we don't know where. It doesn't have to be the subject or the predicate of its own premise. The same thing is true about the minor term. We know it appears somewhere in the minor premise, we just don't know where. It has to be the subject of the conclusion, but in its own premise, it can be the subject or the predicate. It can go first or second. And of course, the term I haven't even mentioned yet, the middle term, we have no idea where the middle term goes right now. We know it'll appear once in the major premise and once in the minor premise, but we don't know where, right? Could be M here and then M there. Or it could be M goes first both times. It's the subject both times. Or maybe it's the predicate both times. Or for that matter, maybe it's the opposite of what we started with. Maybe it goes as the subject of the minor premise, but the predicate of the major premise, right? If we want to build out a schema right now, what you should be noticing is that EIO is not enough. We also need some way to communicate where the terms go in these 4 remaining blanks. So we do that in terms of the middle term. Wherever the middle term goes determines what we call the figure of a syllogism. So again, the form of a syllogism is its mood plus its figure. Mood we took care of in the last lesson. Figure we're now looking at in lesson 22. So let's go ahead and read here. The figure of a syllogism is a number identifying the placement of the middle term in an argument. There are 4 possible ways the middle term can be arranged in our 2 premises. Figure 1 has the middle term as the subject of the major premise and then the predicate of the minor premise. Figure 2 has the middle term second both times. That's how I remember it. It's the predicate of both the major premise and the minor premise. Figure 3 has the middle term first both times. It's the subject of both the major premise and the minor premise. And figure 4, finally, you'll notice it's the opposite of figure 1. In fact, I would recommend that you circle or highlight these the way that I have, so you can see there's a kind of symmetry going on here. Figure 1, middle term first and then second. Figure 2, middle term second both times. Figure 3, middle term third both times. Figure 4, not third, middle term first both times. Figure 4, middle term second and then first. Predicate and then subject. And we could even turn that into our own little TikTok dance, right? But we're not going to do that right now. We do need to memorize this figure. We need to know figure 1, middle term goes first and then second. Figure 2, middle term goes second both times. Figure 3, middle term goes first both times. Figure 4, middle term goes second and then first. So let's consider a particular argument here. No Hindus are Christians. Some Indians are Hindus. Therefore, some Indians are not Christians. You should notice this is already in standard order. Your minor term, the subject of the conclusion, is Indians, and of course it appears in its premise, in the minor premise. Your major term, the predicate of the conclusion, is Christians, and of course it appears in its premise. And then the term in bold is our middle term. Hindus appears in both of the premises, but not the conclusion. Now, if we were going to name, first of all, the mood of this syllogism. Wait, I know this was like several minutes ago, but what did we do for mood? Well, you think about the square of opposition. No Hindus are Christians is an E statement. Some Indians are Hindus is an I statement. Some Indians are not Christians is an O statement. So this is another EIO syllogism. But then what about the placement of those middle terms? Again, that's the other thing we didn't know about the argument. In this case, though, we can see, in fact, in the schema, perhaps it's even more obvious, we can see that the middle term appeared first and then second. Which of these figures has the middle term first and then second? Figure 1. And so this is what we would call an EIO1 syllogism. We could have these same statements, and instead it might be the middle term goes second both times. That would be EIO2. Or maybe the middle term appeared as the subject in both premises. That is, it came first both times. That would be EIO3. Or maybe it went second and then first. That would be EIO4. So it turns out that there are 4 different figures that are possible. And of course, you should also recognize there are 4 different statements that are possible, A, E, I, and O, for the major premise. 4 different statements that are possible, A, E, I, and O, for the minor premise. 4 different statements that are possible, A, E, I, and O, for the conclusion. And this is why you will soon learn in math class something called the fundamental counting principle that confirms this for you. This is why, as of today, you know forever and for always, there are only 256 possible syllogisms. That's it. I know that seems like a large number, but again, as of today, as of April 22nd, 2021, you're 12 years old, you're 13 years old, but as of this day, you know every single syllogism that could possibly appear. You can actually see a list of these if I can get my little thing to pop up, which apparently I can't. Go all the way to the back. And there it is, page 293. That is an actual list of every single one of the 256 possible forms for syllogisms. These are the only possible 256 forms. That is that. All right, so that, I really wish I could get the little scroll bar thing to pop up. Where did we leave off? Oh, goodness. A lot of hard work. Good work, guys. Man, we're just crushing it. I still hear the woodpecker in the background. I don't know if you guys do. That is how we identify the form of a syllogism. The mood is the kind of The mood is the kind of statement we use for the major premise, minor premise, conclusion, always in that order. A, E, I, or O, where does it go on the square of opposition? And then the figure tells us how to arrange the middle terms, which really tells us how to arrange all the terms in the argument. Your homework is exercises 20 and 21. You're supposed to go to these syllogisms 1 through 4 and identify what their mood is. You can see number 1 there done for you. Hopefully you can figure out why. That's an AOO2 syllogism. On 5 and 6, it's not given to you in standard order, so you need to figure out the standard order by identifying the conclusion and then rearranging it into major premise, minor premise, conclusion, and then give me the mood and figure once it is in standard order. Finally, on exercise 21, given a mood and figure, given the form of a syllogism, I want you to write your own schema. So this means that on, like, number 2, an IAI syllogism, well, I statements are some blank are blank. A statements, all blank are blank. I statements, again, some blank are blank. And of course, that's our conclusion. We always know it goes S and then P for the conclusion. And then what did we just learn figure 2 means? It means that the middle term appears second both times. So middle term must go there. Of course, the major term appears in the major premise, so P goes in that remaining blank for the first sentence. Of course, the minor term appears in the minor premise, so S goes in that remaining blank for the minor premise. And that is our schema for number 2. Good luck to you on the homework. I will see you next week. Have a great weekend. Goodbye.